Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going deep on something pretty profound, I think. The idea of temples, but not just any temples. Temples as like reflections of the cosmos.
Hmm.
You sent over some excerpts from a book, The Temple and the Church,
Right.
and it's got me thinking about temples in a whole new way, to be honest. Like
Yeah.
way more than just buildings.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
We're going to tackle some pretty big questions today, like was the Garden of Eden, think about this, the first temple?
Interesting.
And what did ancient cultures believe, way back when about their temples and like divine rest?
Hmm.
And this whole idea of a cosmic blueprint, how does that connect to us today, like thousands of years later?
Yeah, it's truly a fascinating exploration, this whole concept. I think what really struck me about this book in particular is how it challenges, our typical understanding of what a temple even is.
Yeah.
I mean, we often picture, just buildings, physical structures.
Yeah.
But this book really pushes us to see them as, like you said, these microcosms of the entire universe, that ancient cultures, especially those in the Old Testament, they saw it that way.
Microcosms. Okay, so not just a place of worship, but like a reflection of the whole universe. How does that even work? I don't even know where to begin.
Well, imagine this three-part structure. Okay.
3 parts.
You've got the outer court.
Right.
And that's like representing the earthly realm, right? Where we
Right.
live and move and all that.
Right, okay.
And then you move inward to the holy place. And that's symbolizing the visible heavens, the stars, the celestial bodies, all of that.
I see, okay. So we're moving up, kind of.
Yeah. And then finally, you get to the most sacred space, the Holy of Holies. And that represents the invisible divine realm where God dwelled.
Oh, wow.
So you have this movement from the earthly to the heavenly, all within the structure of the temple itself.
So are you saying they were looking at their temples and seeing a miniature model of the whole universe? That's kind of blowing my mind.
It is pretty mind-blowing. And what's even more interesting is this book's argument that the Garden of Eden was actually the first temple, like
Yeah.
the blueprint for all the rest.
Wow.
It's like the prototype.
The OG temple. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting thought. I never, thought about it that way. So how do they back that up? How does the book connect those two things, Eden and temples?
Well, they draw some pretty compelling parallels. One of the most, I think, convincing is the presence of God.
Yeah. Okay.
So in Eden, you have God walking with Adam, right?
Right.
Just as he was said to dwell in the tabernacle and later in the temple.
Yeah, like he's present in both places.
Exactly. So this suggests a real continuity, connection between Eden and these later sacred spaces. It's like a thread running through, the whole biblical narrative.
So it's like the Garden of Eden becomes more than just paradise. It's like the original sanctuary, the first place where heaven and earth kind of met,
Exactly. Yeah. It's where that connection was first established, and the temple becomes a way of continuing and deepening that connection.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm curious, is that just like the book's interpretation, or is there any other evidence to support this idea of Eden as a temple?
Well, that's what I like about this book. They actually delve into early Jewish interpretations as well. Like they talk about the Book of Jubilees,
Okay, to Jubilees.
which also presents Eden as a sanctuary. Now, Jubilees, it's a fascinating text, kind of expands on the Genesis narrative, but it's clear in Jubilees that Eden's seen as this holy place set apart by God.
So there's historical backing for this.
Right.
It's not just like some new idea.
It's rooted in these ancient interpretations of the scriptures.
That's pretty cool. It really makes you rethink the whole Eden story,
It does. It does.
But were the Israelites the only ones who thought this way? Like the only ones who saw their temples as, reflections of the cosmos?
That's a great question, and it's actually something the book addresses too. The answer is no, not at all.
Okay, good. I was hoping you'd say that.
Many ancient Near Eastern cultures, they also shared this idea of temples as places of divine rest,
Rest.
where the gods, resided after they created the world and subdued chaos. You see this pattern across different cultures, which is really interesting.
I love when we can get specific examples.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Did any come to mind?
Well, think about the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish.
Okay.
After their labors, the gods, what do? They build shrines for themselves to rest in.
Interesting.
Right? Or look at the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses III. He actually incorporated gardens within his temples, these beautiful spaces designed specifically for the deities to enjoy, to rest.
So it's like they created these little vacation spots for their gods.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Wow. Okay, so this idea of the temple as a place where, like, the divine chills out after, creating the world, that was a pretty, like, common idea back then.
Precisely. And, it kind of makes sense when you think about it. It seems to reflect this universal human desire to connect with the divine,
Yeah,
to find a place where heaven and earth meet, a point of contact between the human and the divine.
that's beautifully put. I like
And
this.
what this book does so well is it argues that the concept of the temple, it wasn't just this static thing. It was actually expanding.
Expanding. Hold on. Are we talking about bigger buildings?
It's a much grander idea than that. It's about more than just physical size.
Okay.
We need to connect this back to the bigger picture, I think. If we go back to that Adamic commission in Genesis, right?
Okay.
Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it.
Yeah.
It suggests that humanity was actually tasked with expanding the boundaries of God's presence, like making the whole world a temple.
Whoa. So less about bigger buildings and more about, like, expanding the concept of a temple to encompass, like, the whole world.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the sacredness of all creation.
That's a big idea. So how does that play out? How do we see that happening in, like, the biblical narrative?
Well, think about the patriarchs.
Yeah.
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They built altars,
Yeah.
right? And they pitched their tents on mountains.
Yeah. Okay.
These actions, they mirror temple construction, but on a smaller scale.
Mhm.
It's almost as if they were carrying out that Adamic commission, spreading God's presence outward, step by step.
It's like they're laying the groundwork for this expanding temple,
Yeah, exactly.
preparing the world for God's presence to, like, fill it. It gives a whole new dimension to those stories, doesn't it?
It really does. And that idea, this idea of the temple expanding, it becomes even more explicit in later Old Testament books.
Okay, where do we see that?
Well, there's a passage in Numbers, for instance, where Israel is described as a tabernacle, but a tabernacle that's spreading out like a garden by the river.
Wow, that's beautiful imagery.
Right. And then you have Isaiah, and he describes Jerusalem, the city of the temple. He describes it as expanding outward, stretching like a tent to make space for a larger and larger population. It's like the temple's bursting at the seams, pushing its boundaries further and further.
I love that. The temple's not content to stay put. It's got to grow.
Exactly. And then you have this really powerful imagery in the book of Daniel, a vision of a stone. But this stone, it's cut without hands, and it grows into this massive mountain that fills the entire earth.
That's a pretty wild vision.
It is. And this book argues that it's not just about empires. It's about a temple that expands to encompass the whole world.
Whoa. So we've gone from a garden sanctuary to a cosmic blueprint to this idea of an ever-expanding temple. It's a pretty wild ride. But how does the New Testament fit into all of this? Like, does Jesus just continue this whole expanding temple thing?
That's where things get really interesting. The New Testament reimagines the concept of the temple in a really radical way.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It portrays Jesus as both fulfilling the Old Testament temple, but also exceeding it.
That's where I get a bit lost. How can Jesus be the temple?
Well, think about Jesus' statement about destroying the temple and raising it in 3 days.
Yeah, okay.
Now, this was understood to refer to his death and resurrection.
Right. Yeah, he's talking about himself.
Exactly.
Right.
The point is that now Jesus himself is considered the new temple, but it's a temple not made by human hands. It echoes that vision from Daniel we just talked about, a temple not limited by physical boundaries.
So does that mean there's no place for physical buildings anymore? Like, are churches obsolete?
Not necessarily. It's not about getting rid of buildings altogether. It's about a shift in emphasis. The emphasis now is on a spiritual temple,
Okay.
with Jesus as the cornerstone. And this is where Paul's writings come in.
Paul, right.
He describes the church, the body of Christ, as the temple of the living God.
Oh, okay. So now the temple is like a living, growing community.
It is. It highlights that the temple isn't just a place. It's a people, a community united by their faith in Christ and indwelt by the Holy Spirit.
Okay, so we've gone from a garden to a building to a people. This is a lot to take in.
It's a pretty amazing progression, isn't it?
It is. It is. But I have to ask, now, how does Revelation fit into all this? It's got all that, like, wild imagery
Oh, yeah.
and some pretty intense temple stuff, right?
Absolutely. Revelation definitely takes the imagery of the temple to its climax, especially in chapters 11 and 21 and 22.
Okay, I'm bracing myself. Can you unpack that for us a little bit? What's going on in those chapters?
Well, in Revelation 11, the church is explicitly described as the temple. The church as the temple. Yeah. And it's being measured and protected by God. Yeah. And then in Revelation 21, you have that stunning vision of the New Jerusalem descending from heaven.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful image.
Right. And God and the Lamb, they are its temple.
So all this talk about temples throughout the Bible, it eventually leads to like a new creation where God's presence just fills everything.
Precisely. It's the culmination of this whole temple theme that we've been tracing. And that brings us to a really crucial question for you, the listener.
Uh-oh, here it comes.
If we are part of this expanding temple today, right now, how does that change our understanding of our role in the world?
Whoa, that's a big question. Like you're asking us to rethink our entire purpose?
It's not about overthinking. It's about living out this truth. Remember, the temple was meant to be a meeting point for heaven and earth.
Yeah.
So if we are the temple now, then we are called to be that meeting point.
That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
Okay, but how do we live as a part of this expanding temple? Like it's a beautiful concept, but how do we actually, put it into practice? What does that look like in our everyday lives?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Well, I think it's helpful to go back to that first commission given to Adam in the garden, to cultivate and keep it.
Right.
It wasn't just about gardening. It was about stewardship, caring for God's creation.
So are you saying that being the temple, it's about more than just, our spiritual lives? Like it's about how we interact with the world around us, the physical world?
Yeah, absolutely. It's about recognizing that the earth itself is sacred, a reflection of God's glory, and that we're responsible for tending to it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I imagine it's not just about the environment, right? We're also called to care for each other, for the people who, make up this living temple.
Precisely. The book of 1 Peter, it describes us as living stones, being built up into this spiritual house.
Living stones, yeah.
And each of us has a role to play in constructing this temple, supporting and encouraging one another, being those living stones together.
So it's about building bridges, not walls, right? Like cultivating relationships, showing compassion, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's about reflecting God's love and grace in how we treat others, creating spaces where people feel welcomed and valued and loved, embodying that love.
Okay, yeah, this idea of temple expansion is starting to feel less like abstract and more like something I can actually do, It's more tangible.
It should be practical. It should change how we live.
Yeah, absolutely. But doesn't Revelation also talk about, like, God ultimately bringing about this new creation? I'm trying to figure out where our efforts fit in if, God's the one doing the heavy lifting.
It's not an either situation. It's both hand.
Okay, both hand, yeah?
Yes, God ultimately brings about the new creation, but he chooses to do it through us.
So we're like God's instruments, like helping to build this new temple, this new world.
Think of it as a partnership. God provides the blueprint, the power, the ultimate vision. But we are called to be his co-laborers, actively participating in the work he's doing.
Wow, I like that. This feels like empowering, knowing that even like small acts of love or kindness or justice, they actually contribute to this bigger picture of temple expansion.
It's about recognizing that our everyday choices, our words, our actions, they all have significance.
Yeah.
They could either contribute to the building up of God's kingdom or to its tearing down.
So even like seemingly insignificant things like choosing to recycle or forgiving someone who's wronged us or speaking up against injustice, those can all be acts of temple building.
Absolutely. They're all ways of participating in God's work of restoring and renewing creation.
Wow, this deep dive is really challenging me to see my life, my faith in a whole new way. Like I see how everything's connected, how even the mundane can be infused with this like spiritual significance.
That's the beauty of it.
It is. But if I'm honest, it's a bit daunting too. Like this cosmic vision of temple expansion, it feels so vast, so beyond my control,
I think that's where faith comes in.
Faith, right?
It's trusting that even though we can't see the full picture, even though our efforts seem small, God is at work, weaving them into his grand tapestry of redemption.
So it's not about like striving for perfection or trying to like single-handedly change the world, but just about faithfully doing what we can right where we are.
Precisely. It's about being faithful stewards of the gifts and opportunities God has given us, trusting he will multiply our efforts for his glory.
I love that. It's a call to action, but also a reminder to like rest in God's grace. It's a beautiful paradox, wouldn't you say?
It is. It is. And speaking of paradox, the book highlights how the New Testament understanding of the temple, it goes beyond even this idea of global expansion.
Hold on, there's more. My mind is officially blown. What are we getting into now?
Well, we've talked about the temple as a cosmic blueprint, then as Eden, then expanding to encompass the world, and now with Jesus as a living community.
Right, right. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. But the book takes it a step further, arguing that this community itself, this living temple, it's actually a reflection of a deeper reality,
Okay. A reflection of what?
the heavenly temple.
Okay, you've piqued my curiosity,
Ah.
but I gotta be honest, I'm a little lost. Can you break it down for me? Like, what do you mean by a reflection of the heavenly temple?
Okay, so remember how in Revelation 11, the church is depicted as the temple, measured and protected by God.
Yeah, I remember that.
And then in Revelation 21, we have that vision of the New Jerusalem descending from heaven with God and the Lamb as its temple. Remember that?
Yeah, it's all starting to come back.
Good. So the book suggests that these passages, they're pointing to a heavenly reality that's being mirrored here on earth. The church, this community of believers, it's like an embassy, a glimpse of that heavenly temple right here, right now.
So it's not just about expanding the temple outward into the world, but also reflecting this heavenly reality inward into the church.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a way of life that reflects the love, the joy, the peace, the holiness, the unity that characterizes the heavenly temple.
This adds like a whole new layer of meaning to this idea of being the temple. It's not just about doing things, it's about being a certain way.
And that being flows naturally from our relationship with Christ. As we abide in him, as we allow his Spirit to transform us, we become more like him, and therefore more like the heavenly temple that he embodies.
So it's about allowing the characteristics of the heavenly temple, like love, joy, peace, to flow through us and into the world.
Precisely. It's about letting our lives be a reflection of that reality, a reality that we will one day experience fully in the new creation.
You know, it makes me think about the word worship. Like, we often associate it with singing songs or going to church, but maybe it's really about, like, embodying this heavenly temple, reflecting God's glory in everything we do.
That's a powerful insight. Worship isn't confined to a specific time or place. It's a way of life. It's about aligning our hearts, our minds, our actions with God's will, allowing his presence to shine through us.
Wow. This deep dive is really stretching my understanding of like what it even means to be a follower of Christ. It's not just about, personal salvation. It's about participating in God's grand cosmic plan of redemption.
And that plan isn't just about the future. It's about bringing the reality of that heavenly temple into the here and now, creating glimpses of heaven on earth.
And we can't do that alone, right? Like we need each other to build each other up, encourage one another, reflect God's love together. It's the power of community.
Absolutely. And that community, it extends beyond our local churches or denominations. It encompasses all those who are in Christ, who are part of this living, growing temple.
It makes me think about how I interact with other Christians, even those who may be different from me. Like, if we're all part of the same temple, we need to learn to love and value one another, to see each other as fellow living stones.
Right. And that love, that unity, it's a powerful witness to the world. It reflects the very heart of God, who desires all people to be reconciled to himself and to each other.
Let's pause here for a moment and just like let all this sink in. We've covered so much ground, from the cosmic blueprint of temples to the idea of Eden as the first sanctuary, the temple expanding to encompass the world, and now this idea of the church as a reflection of the heavenly temple. It's a lot.
It is a lot to process, but it's incredibly enriching. It shows how this concept of the temple, it runs like a golden thread throughout the entire Bible, culminating in this incredible vision of a new creation where God's presence just fills everything. It's a beautiful story.
And we're not just like passive bystanders in the story. We're active participants. We're called to be those living stones, reflecting God's glory, expanding his kingdom, creating those glimpses of heaven on earth. It's a daunting task, but it's an exciting one too.
It is. It is. And it all starts with that simple but profound recognition that we are the temple, a dwelling place for God's Spirit, a reflection of his love, a signpost pointing to the new creation that he's bringing about.
This deep dive has given me a whole new perspective on my faith, my life, my role in the world. Like, I feel challenged, inspired, and a little overwhelmed all at the same time.
I think that's a good sign, isn't it?
Yeah, it means we're on to something important.
It certainly does. And before we wrap up this incredible journey, there's one more crucial aspect of this expanding temple that I think we need to explore.
Oh, there's more. Okay, hit me with it.
It's the idea that the temple isn't just a place of divine presence, where God resides,
Right.
but also a place of divine action.
Wait, what does that mean? Are you saying the temple goes beyond just being a symbol and actually does something? Yeah, you're right. That is a fascinating idea. It's like the temple is more than just a static thing. So the temple isn't just a place where like something exists, but a place where something happens. Tell me more about this divine action thing.
Well, to understand that, I think it helps to go back to the Old Testament. Think about the role of the temple back then. It wasn't simply a place where people just went to, have this passive experience of God.
Right, right. It was more than just like a holy huddle.
Exactly. It was also a place where God's power was actively at work in the world. Like things were happening there.
Okay, can you give me some like specific examples? I'm trying to picture how this divine action thing actually played out.
Sure. Well, think about it. The temple was the very heart of Israel's religious and social life.
Hmm.
It was where sacrifices were offered, laws were given, kings were crowned. It was where people went to see healing and justice. All of that was happening in the temple.
Okay, so it wasn't just a quiet place for like contemplation. It was like a bustling center of activity, like a hub.
Exactly. And all that activity, it was seen as an extension of God's work in the world.
Oh, interesting. So it's like the temple was a place where God's will was being done, not just talked about.
Right. And even the sacrifices,
Yeah.
they weren't just about like appeasing an angry God. They were about restoring right relationships
Yeah.
between humanity and God, and even between people themselves.
Yeah, like making things right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you start to see how the temple was like this conduit for God's grace.
Okay, a conduit, I like that, like a channel.
Yeah, a place where his power flowed out to heal and transform the world around it.
And if Jesus is the new temple and we, the church, are his body, like we've been talking about, does that mean that same power is available to us?
That is the question.
Could we also be those conduits for God's grace and healing?
That's a powerful insight, and I think that's exactly what this book is getting at. It's arguing that as the temple, we're not just called to reflect God's presence passively,
Right.
but to actively participate in his work of redemption.
Okay, so it's not just about having good intentions or, being nice. It's about actively engaging in the work of justice, mercy, healing, all that stuff that God is doing in the world.
Precisely. It's about becoming partners with God, working alongside him to bring about his kingdom, extending his love and grace to those who are hurting and lost.
This is really challenging me to move beyond simply like thinking about the temple as a concept and start, living it out in a more tangible way.
It is a call to action, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's also a call to empowerment. Remember, we don't do this work on our own.
Yeah.
We have the Holy Spirit living within us, empowering us to do the works that Jesus did and even greater works.
It's like we're plugged into this divine power source. So it's a call to be bold then, to take risks, trusting that God will work through us even when we feel, inadequate or afraid.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
about saying yes to God's call, even when it seems impossible, knowing that he will equip us for the task.
Wow. This whole deep dive has been such a journey. We started with this book about temples, and we ended up exploring like the very nature of God, humanity, and our place in his grand cosmic plan. Who knew?
It's amazing how seemingly simple concepts can lead us to such profound truths. That's the beauty of diving deep. Right?
It is. So as we wrap up, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listener walks away with today?
I hope they understand this. The temple isn't just an ancient relic or some theological abstraction. It's a living, breathing reality that's relevant to our lives today. It's alive and it's active.
And we, as followers of Christ, we're called to be part of this ever-expanding temple, reflecting God's presence, participating in his action, working alongside him to bring about his kingdom.
Beautifully put. It's a high calling, but also an incredible privilege.
It is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been, mind-blowing. And remember, dear listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking truth.